Our second speaker is Dr. Becca Franks, an assistant professor of environmental studies at New York University. Dr. Franks researches animal behavior, aquatic animal welfare, and human-animal relationships. Today, she will reflect on research opportunities to study positive emotions in animals. Welcome, Dr. Franks.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to take a second to pull my slides up. And
it looks perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much to Professor Fredrickson for that incredible talk. I learned so much. I have so many questions. I think it's really inspirational. So I want to talk about positive emotions and welfare for the 21st century, and I have a picture here of a cuttlefish on a reef, and I think, they sort of, for me, represent sort of what positive emotions are, in the sense that it's sort of a wild and new space to be considering. I also just think they're fascinating, and there are currently efforts to farm them, so their welfare is at risk as well. I'll start with some thank yous to various funding support and institutional support, especially the Environmental Studies Department at NYU, and some amazing colleagues who I've worked with on these ideas over the years, especially Jennifer Jacquette, Chowen Chang, Lori Sellers, Christine Webb, Matthew Hayek, Aaron Ryan, Pablo Perez Castello, and Jeff Sivo. So as Dr. Fredrickson was alluded to briefly, positive emotions exist in the same universe, galaxies, star cluster, what have you, as the good life or positive welfare. But they're not the same thing, and I'm just going to leave it there. There are theories out there, of course, that suggest that positive welfare is just an aggregation of positive emotions minus negative emotions. There's other perspectives that say positive emotions feed into positive welfare and the good life, but other elements are important as well. For this talk, I'm going to remain silent on that, not weigh in either way or the other, but I'm mentioning it because I do just want to highlight that at least there's some distinction between positive emotions and positive welfare and the good life. And we're just focusing at the beginning, at least, on positive emotions here. And I am grateful to do that. There's enough complexity here to just deal with positive emotions. And then it gets even more complicated to talk about positive welfare. So I think I'm grateful to the organizers that we're focusing on positive emotions for this, and then leaving positive welfare to the side for a minute. So I want to begin with just a sort of brief tour of the evidence, and then a worked example in zebrafish, just to sort of like spark some conversation about what we're going to do about measuring positive emotions in species that are quite different from us, and then spend some time thinking about the implications for animal welfare and what to do going forward. So first, very briefly, what are some examples that are consistent with positive emotions in non-human animals? I think the most obvious one that jumps to mind is play across the animal kingdom, and it really is evident more and more obviously across many different taxa and different species, including animals that are quite distantly related to us, like octopuses and bumblebees. Interest has been operationalized in the animal behavior literature as curiosity, and that has been studied and established across the animal kingdom for decades now. Amusement, perhaps looked at more recently, but still with a long history. So there's vocalizations, ultrasonic vocalizations that rats make in acute situations of pleasure that have been argued to be analogous to laughter. And recently a study came out looking at teasing behavior in great apes. There's also evidence for insight in particular contexts. Really critical study in cows found that the cows who were learning opposed to a yoked control group of cows showed physiological arousal and accelerated behavioral movements that were consistent with having sort of an aha moment when they were learning a task. Inspiration might be evidenced by something like creativity, which have been studied in dolphins and great apes and various corvids, and could be studied in other species as well. And I think quite centrally and critically that resonates with Dr. Fredrickson's talk is the role of social relationships, bonding and belonging that we might see through social motivations and dynamics that have been discussed in the animal literature, and in particular, synchrony and the importance of synchrony. So diving into a more specific example with some zebrafish who I was working with at the University of British Columbia a few years ago. Briefly, we kept them in these more complex environments with sloping gravel substrate and plants and low fish density compared to the standard housing for zebrafish. And fed them a mixed diet and checked their welfare every day. So we had 6 tanks with about 10 fish per tank. And on any given day, if you walked in and looked at the fish, I'm not going to play the video here because I was worried about the connection, but basically these little blurs here are the zebrafish. And the baseline behavior, you would see them scattered throughout the tank, swimming back and forth, not really coordinating in any kind of way, and occasionally doing these little chases and charges, maintaining distance from each other. So that was like just a normal day, any given moment. But we noticed this very discrete, different behavior happening, and we had video cameras on these tanks 24 hours a day. And we could see them when we were fast forwarding through the videos, and it really captured our attention because it was so discretely different. And so we decided to call it heightened shoaling. Shoaling behavior is when fish come together in any kind of aggregation, but this was like more intense than just a regular sort of shoaling event, and wanted to do some research to just sort of describe and parameterize what was happening here. So here's an image of what heightened shoaling looks like. You can see that all the fish are all sort of clumped together in the middle here. They're mostly oriented in the same horizontal plane. And so we wanted to sort of look at that behavior a little bit more. So the first thing we did is a scan sampling. So we pulled out 4-minute video segments during a heightened shoaling event versus a baseline event versus before they're getting fed, and just wrote down where each fish was in the tank and what their orientation was in space. And so then this is the video looking at the tank from the side. So you can see this is where the slope is, so you don't see any fish there, but then each dot is a observation of a fish. And during baseline, they're sort of like distributed pretty evenly across the space that's available to them. Before feeding, you can see that they're coming up to the surface. It's darker in the surface, and then in particular in this corner. And guess what? That's where they got fed. And then during heightened shoaling, they were aggregated and clumped in the center. And you can see that it's very rare to even see any fish that aren't in that grouping. We can use this data to measure interfish distances. And what you can see here is that heightened shoaling is essentially a non-overlapping distribution in terms of the interfish distances. They're just much, much closer together. It's not like taking the higher upper end of baseline behavior and lopping it off and saying it's something else. It's something almost completely distinct and discrete compared to their normal behavior. And then looking at the orientation that they had in space, they were much more synchronized than they were under normal baseline conditions and pre-feed conditions. So this was highly statistically significant. So there's just a lot more synchrony during these events. And despite the fact that they were incredibly close together, there was almost no agonism. So no aggression, no chasing and charges, despite the close proximity. Then we also did all occurrence sampling, where we looked at the entire day for several days, every single tank, and just recorded whether or not we saw a heightened shoaling instance or not, and if we did, how long it lasted. And what we found is that the heightened shoaling events lasted for a median of about 7 minutes, but sometimes lasted up for 30 minutes. And they happened throughout the day in terms of like when the lights were on, we didn't look when the lights were off. And they very rarely happened at the same time. I think there was only one instance where we saw two tanks doing it at the same time. It was almost always just one tank doing it and then later another tank doing it. And we found it in every single tank, and usually they do it once a day, but not always, sometimes more, sometimes less. So the ways in which this behavior, which maybe doesn't have anything comparable to human behavior in a direct sense, but still can sort of, if we're trying to understand, is it more consistent with like some positive affect happening or negative affect happening, we're seeing consistency with positive emotions or positive affect. So that there's high participation, which suggests that it's attractive. It's protracted in time. It lasts for 7 minutes, so not all day or something like that, but it's not like a fleeting instant. So it seems to be self-reinforcing. We saw no signs of negative affect. So we didn't see any aggression, but we also didn't see erratic swimming, which in zebrafish is a sign of negative affect, or diving behavior, which is another response that zebrafish have under stressful conditions. There was a high degree of synchrony, which is something that we see across species and positive emotional states or potentially positive emotional states. And it was spontaneous, which suggests that it was driven by internal group dynamics rather than something that is reactive. And then just looking across other studies that we've done and looking at these, sort of characteristic parameters of cohesion and coordination, we're building up more and more evidence. So we see in free choice exploration opportunities, we see greater cohesion and coordination when the fish were presented with novel objects that they could choose to interact with and novel spaces. So this would be opportunities for exploration and curiosity, for example. And it decreased with a stressor. So when the tanks got cleaned, we'd see heightened stress behavior, the erratic swimming, diving to the bottom of the tank, and lower cohesion and coordination. So altogether, this is starting to paint a picture of something that is more consistent with positive emotion than with negative. And sorry. And so, this for me is something that's really interesting to explore, especially if we're not beginning with an anthropocentric starting point of like something that we're looking for an analog for, which I think is an interesting way forward, though somewhat challenging. Okay, so thinking about the implications of the existence of positive emotions in non-human animals, the first thing that comes up for sure is measurement. And I would like to direct your attention to a recent review in Biological Reviews, Joyful by Nature, Approaches to Investigate the Evolution and Function of Joy in Non-Human Animals. And they cover a lot of ground here, but one of the sections is on measurement. And I, in particular, am interested in these behavioral indicators of joy in positive context. And I think this prompts the first research question for us as animal welfare scientists: is measuring behavior in or right after situations that we know to be highly rewarding. So for example, across many, many different studies now in the last just a handful of years, we know that cows are highly motivated to reunite with their calves. And so looking at the behaviors directly after that, characteristic of those sort of like highly rewarding situations. But you can imagine doing that across a bunch of different contexts where we have good evidence that the situation is acutely and highly rewarding for animals, and looking at the actual behaviors that they're engaging in right after. And then turning to Professor Fredrickson's work, I think that there's a real wealth of positive emotion and diversity in positive emotion, especially when you turn to the psychology and social psychology literature. And I think that it would be really interesting to really lean into that diversity of reward contexts and then therefore emotions. So if we look across, there's 10 emotions listed here in her 2013 paper. The first 5, joy, gratitude, serenity, and trust and hope. And these themes about being safe, but unexpectedly good, receiving a gift or a benefit, safe, familiar, but low effort for serenity, interest, safe, but novel. So this is sort of consistent with that idea of free choice exploration rather than forced exploration. Hope being fearing the worst, but yearning for better. And then we see other sort of words that can help us sort of think about the different possibilities, like play, savoring, integrating information, having new skills that are being built, etc. There's also pride, amusement, inspiration, awe, and love. And I think, again, there's some like indicators here of interesting places that could be explored. I don't know off the top of my head of anything related to pride. I did mention a few examples for amusement and inspiration. For awe, I think one of the interesting things to consider is this encounter with beauty and the increasing recognition in animal behavior and evolutionary biology that there might be some sort of aesthetic sense that different species have, and exploring what that might mean. And love being connected, obviously, to social bonding. So, thinking about how positive emotions then might relate to the good life or positive welfare, I think we need to introduce the time component. And I'm going to still be agnostic about the model that we're using, whether or not it's an sort of additive utilitarian function that is just some sort of aggregation method of all the positive emotions minus the negative ones, or something more complicated. Either way, if we think about all the different contexts that we're looking at that would produce positive emotions, I think it would inevitably pull in any other sort of models that you might be thinking about in terms of what constitutes a good life, like a meaningful life or a rich life. And my understanding of the social psychology literature is that it tends to acknowledge a sort of richer and broader set of events and experiences that are required for a good life or positive welfare. But again, I don't think you even have to make that larger philosophical claim, because inevitably the kind of things that you need, I think, would serve both. So even if you're just trying to serve positive emotions, I think you end up pulling in these other dimensions as well. So the promising dimensions are having some sort of social stability so that you can build those social bonds, but also variety and an opportunity to sort of self-regulate around social interactions. Having meaningful choice sets, so not just choices about things that are sort of like irrelevant, but things that actually matter, and figuring out what those are for particular species and individuals. Freedom of movement, and opportunities for exploration, to just like give you that sort of rich baseline that would allow for a variety of positive emotions to be built up. And then something like an upward spiral, we could examine whether or not that works in animals. But I think there's a lot to explore there. And so that leads to the third research question, which is looking at positive emotions over time and the sort of dynamics and how that relates to the good life and positive welfare and how we would measure that. I think this is also an area ripe for further exploration. The details will matter, obviously, and they will vary dramatically species by species. And I don't want to oversimplify things here, but I think all things being equal, one of the things that we can recognize to sort of foster that range of positive emotions, and even any specific positive emotion, that if we're comparing simple to complex environments, simple is not going to be able to support the experience of positive emotions, whereas a complex environment will. Again, oversimplification, but in the aggregate and the details. Okay, so let's take a step back, think about scope, both in terms of the scope of what's happening on the planet, and also the scope of now what the research agenda is for animal welfare scientists. So looking at meat production by livestock, this is terrestrial animals across the past several decades. Every single category has increased over the past few decades, such that now we have about 70 billion individual animals being slaughtered each year. Aquaculture, the farming of aquatic animals, is a similar picture, but with some important differences. What you can see here is that in the 90s, the capture fisheries flatlined, and that's despite throwing more and more resources and going further and further out into the ocean, where basically, there's less and less fish in the wild for us to catch. And then aquaculture has stepped in and gone from almost nothing on the global stage to now it's over half of the food production of aquatic life forms is coming from farmed fishes, such that now there's probably over 100 billion individual animals being slaughtered each year. But it's very importantly different, and I don't have time to get into the details that much, but I'm happy to talk about it in questions, from the terrestrial system, because we're also talking about 400 different species. So in the terrestrial system, it's, probably 20 or less. So we have, 20 times as much species, and that's, a huge diversity of animals and their welfare to be, understood at a level that would provide the sort of like legal protections for them that's required. So it's kind of an entirely different world. I'm going to focus mostly on the terrestrial system, but come back to the aquaculture briefly later. So when we think about these, hundreds of billions of animals and what their life is like in these systems on the, planet, the data is actually, to me, somewhat surprisingly, a little bit hard to come by. It's not a hugely active area of research, but the best evidence that I can come across suggests that the vast majority of them are in something that could be classified as a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a factory farm. So, over 99% and well over half for all the different kinds of animals in the US that are being farmed. So I think that actually brings us to another research question that I think is actually prompted and related to positive welfare more so than negative welfare, which I will get to in a second, but basically classifying and quantifying current practices globally in this expansion and what that actually looks like on the ground. So, this is the way that most chickens are kept on the global stage. Certainly the US is way worse in this regard than Europe, but then other countries are going to be maybe more similar to the US. But this is standard in the US at least. So I think this really, for me, brings up something that's quite different about positive welfare or positive emotions compared to negative when you have a negative frame. So the history of the field, as we all know, has been focused on the alleviation of suffering, which was very justifiably prompted by, as we heard about in the first talk, that suffering is acute, it's urgent, it is stronger motivating force for the person experiencing it than positive welfare. And so I think there's plenty of reasons and justifiable reasons and good reasons to be focused on the alleviation of suffering and reducing suffering. But basically, if you're looking at a situation like this, you always are going to be able to adjust parameters or look for parameters to adjust so that you can reduce suffering in the system. And that I think is a totally valid and necessary and very important thing to be doing. But once you start talking about positive emotions, I think we have to admit that this system is just simply incongruous with positive emotions. The system itself is not going to foster love and trust and gratitude and joy. It is not in any sort of like regular way that would have some chance of building to something like positive welfare. I think you can have some instances of it, but I think in terms of actually like having some sort of stable thing that would have some face validity of actually being positive welfare ultimately is going to be difficult, if not impossible, in these sorts of systems. So we're actually just having to think. I think positive emotions and the questions around that is prompting us to think about different systems. And again, like, a superficial look at this would have something like a more complex environment rather than the very simplistic environment. And so then we have to think about what is it going to take And I think this is not just a difference of degree, but a difference in kind, to jump from, a very simplistic homogeneous system to a more complex system that would be fostering positive emotions and positive welfare. And that leads to some pretty harsh trade-offs. The most obvious of them is land use, just the need for more space per individual, and that space being able to afford then a diversity of experiences. Which then gets into questions about patterns of consumption globally and how much space do we actually have on the planet. And I'm not going to talk about it directly, but I think really critically for us, there's actually some inherent conflicts between the number of individuals and positive welfare that I can unpack, I think, in questions, but I'm going to skip over for now. So with some colleagues, Iris Chan, who is a master's student and a professor in the environmental studies department, Matthew Hayek, we looked at some of these trade-offs in the US broiler chicken production system between welfare, land use, and consumption. And we found a couple of patterns, but I think for today, I just want to focus on if we assume that consumption remains constant, and we compare the different breeds of chickens being used in the United States and how much space they're being given in CAFOs, concentrated feeding lots or operations, is pretty minimal. Giving them a little bit of outdoor space obviously is going to require more land, but research suggests that the kind of space that's given to them in these sort of contexts, they don't really end up using. But giving them like a pasture, a life on pasture, is going to radically multiply the amount of land that's required for the production if consumption is kept constant. And so, that kind of land increase then bumps up against some other, very consequential realities that we're facing, in particular biodiversity collapse and the loss of species around the planet. And that is an existential threat for us on the par with climate change related to, but distinct from. And one of the main drivers of the loss of biodiversity is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So on the one hand, we're looking to improve and promote positive emotions and positive welfare for the chickens so that they can have a more complex environment and more room and more opportunities to have freedom of movement and association. But then we're infringing on, millions of other animals and even risking species extinction by this sort of profound land use increase that would be implied by implementing positive welfare for all the animals in these operations today. So where do we go from here? I don't think this means that this is an impractical area of research. I actually think it brings us to having really difficult conversations that are important conversations to be had. In particular, conducting these sorts of trade-off analyses and looking honestly at what is at stake, what is possible, what is not possible, and what is, going to, we can't have a win-win-win situation in some of these cases. Something's got to give. And generating these trade-off analyses can help us have an informed and extended conversation at sort of society, at regional levels, at national levels, at international levels. But we need the information to feed into those trade-off analyses and conduct more of them, I think, to be able to have that. And to do that, I'm really interested in the idea of diversifying collaborators outside of animal welfare science, so that like working with philosophers, working with political scientists who are interested in, for example, animal representation and the changes that are happening at sociological levels, but also cultures. So, this increase in meat production or, animals in agriculture that's happening globally, that's happening globally, but there's really important differences culture by culture. And so it's important to not essentialize human nature in any kind of way. There's not, one single way of humans engaging in animal agriculture. There's a diversity of ways. And I think like just exploring the, different patterns across different cultures, and of course, these different cultures implementing different practices and different tastes, I think can really help avoid the maybe futility of thinking this is the only way it's going to be, and there's no way to change it. I think it's also important to remember that farmers and workers benefit when animals have good welfare, and talking with them about ways that we can promote good welfare for the animals and what would they see as the barriers to implementation, and just having those sorts of discussions. So talking to them as stakeholders, talking across different stakeholding groups, just doing more sort of like problem solving, bringing these trade-off analyses to the table to have spark those conversations. And then, of course, one health, one welfare, understanding that, human health and our consumption patterns, and then also land use patterns, and also the welfare of animals are all interconnected with each other. So there are places where there's necessary, zero sum, a win for one is a loss for another, but there's other areas where there's space for mutual benefit. So I think just essentially like pulling in natural allies and problem solving going forward. So just very briefly, I hope I have time. I lost track of the time. Aquaculture, like I said, is very different because of that expansion, not just in terms of number, but in terms of species. So one of the things that I've been working on with my colleagues is identifying species that are being targeted for production systems, but just by their species level characteristics and their market characteristics are not wise choices going forward. So we actually have federal legislation now in the US to ban octopus farming. So octopus farming is not currently something that is at scale. It's not being done. There's efforts in various countries around the world to make it a reality, but it's not a reality yet. And we have argued that octopuses are carnivores, which means that they need to be fed animal protein to survive, which is a very inefficient system. We would never dream of like farming tigers, for example, in a terrestrial system, but that's more or less what we're doing in the aquatic system. So farming carnivores is environmentally very costly and not sustainable. But there's also welfare concerns in terms of their complex behavior, their solitary nature, their ability to escape. They're very ill-suited for a life in captivity in terms of how much it would harm their welfare. And then finally, they're going to primarily luxury markets. So it's not a problem solving around food security. So there's all sorts of reasons that this is not a judicious way forward. And it would be better just to actually block that before the infrastructure is built and economies are built around it and you have to undo it, and just signal that this is not a promising way forward, and do that before the path dependencies get built. So there is this federal legislation in the US that's under consideration, which I think is very promising. And I think there's many species actually in aquaculture. In the top left here, we have the red swamp crayfish that actually engages in maternal care across a protracted period of time, and has like stable family relationships, and has various parameters at the species level that we know are going to be very difficult to accommodate in high production systems. And then not only are we expanding in terms of the species, but we're also now expanding into the ocean. So I have other work suggesting that we think very carefully about all of the different sort of impacts that are present once we start encroaching and identifying spaces in the ocean to do more and more farming in the ocean. We currently are not farming very much in the ocean, but analyses are in the works to figure out how to expand, what technologies could be used to expand, and that there's a host of risks associated with that expansion that maybe suggest that it's not a good pathway forward, at least something that we should be very cautious about doing, because it represents a massive change from where we are right now. So just looking back, the research agenda, I think, that is provoked by a question of positive emotions is measuring behavior in rewarding contexts, diversifying the rewarding context that we're studying, and then also therefore the emotions, looking at positive emotions over time and how that might relate to positive welfare and the good life, classifying and quantifying current practices globally. And all of these four questions, I think, lead into this I think very important question for generating the kind of information that we can use to have informed decisions and conversations around this is to conduct trade-off analyses between welfare, land use, consumption patterns, number of individuals, the emissions, livelihoods that are linked to this stuff, health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to questions.